Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance was released in February of 2013 and was met with critical and commercial success on release. The game is fairly highly regarded among the whole character action genre, and is still seen as a high point among the works of developer Platinum Games. Since this isn't a review of the game, I'd be better off just cutting this introduction here and get into one aspect of Revengeance's design which I found to be downright brilliant, which was its boss roster. Yeah, references to rules of nature, memes being the DNA of the soul, and Nanomachine's son have been beaten into the ground, but in-game, the actual encounters with all of the bosses are memorable experiences that successfully merge the two areas which Revengeance excels at. Style, the way which bosses are presented to the player, and substance, how they test the player's mastery over the systems in place. I'm struggling to think of other games which consistently do their rogues gallery as much justice as Revengeance, and honestly at the moment I really can't name another example. Are there better individual boss fights than those on display here? Absolutely, there's many, but the ensemble roster sure as hell isn't anything to sneeze at. So without any more stalling, let's go over how the bosses make such an impression. Before talking about how bosses test players on their grasp of the game's mechanics, we first have to answer the question of what exactly the core tenets of Revengeance's design are. This could be debated. I'll fully admit that I'm no expert on the game, but from where I sit there are two main mechanics which define the style. The Zandatsu, or Blade Mode, whatever you want to call it, and the parry system. The Zandatsu is activated by holding the left trigger and sees Raiden enter a mostly stationary bullet time, where he can cut through objects and foes alike using vertical, horizontal, or freeform slices. The parry is the game's version of a block, where the player can hit the light attack button at the same time of an enemy's attack making impact, while pointing the left stick in said enemy's direction. These are fairly gross simplifications of both, but for the sake of this video, it should get everyone on the same page because each boss in Revengeance requires the player to have a better mastery over them with each encounter. Let's go through the bosses in order to see what I mean. Metal Gear Ray is the first time the player will be introduced to the forced use of Zandatsu against an enemy, a valuable lesson to learn for a tutorial. There's no punishment for failure at this stage, well, not really, and the game is extremely generous with what counts as a success. You have to try, and I mean really try, to fail and actually screw up here. The raid fight also shows off a minor design detail of the game, the Ninja Run. Essentially just a snazzier sprint, Ninja Run lets players move at a much faster pace, automatically traverse through basic platforming, and more importantly for our purposes, deflect oncoming bullets with Raiden's sword. While this may be a bit of a stretch, I think Ninja Run being used during the raid fight is a subtle way to put the idea of an attack acting as a block in the player's head. After all, Raiden is swinging his blade at the bullets, but it's automatically done, which eases players into the concept. Moving on, Blade Wolf has a slow attack moveset with obvious telegraphs to his major moves, which gives the player ample reaction time to land a parry against him, a skill which the game recently explained. The additional enemy waves in this fight act as free health kits for the player, more than likely placed here considering Wolf is the first proper boss fight, and it's also the first fight that ends with a Blade Mode Berserker Barrage where you chop up the boss bit by bit, which is a trend with them going forward. The next boss, Mistral, pushes the player to get a better grasp on the parry with a faster moveset than Wolf, with certain charging attacks that boomerang back and forth hitting multiple times. These moves are mercifully slow, however. There are adds here with the Dwarf Geckos, but unless I'm recalling incorrectly, they can't give you a full health bump like the enemies during the Wolf fight could, making this the first boss fight where you have to walk in with the health that you had at the beginning and nothing else. One final thing Mistral is going for her is how there is an optional use of the precise blade mode cut here. During certain points of the fight, Mistral's hands can glow blue, which indicates that a cut can be pulled off. This isn't required to beat her, but landing one successfully will open her up for some free hits, and this acts as a stealth tutorial for later boss fights where this will become mandatory. We'll brush over the Grad, which comes next, because it's more like a mini-boss considering that it shows up as a regular enemy later on. And frankly, it's just a fight that I've never cared that much for. Can't win them all, I guess. Monsoon is the moment when Revengeance really kicks it up a notch, because it's a fight that basically requires total mastery over the parry system to succeed. Rather than just being able to brute force a few parries like you could with Wolf or Mistral, Monsoon pushes you with attack strings that mandate perfect timing to chain parry, and a smokescreen move that has him teleporting in and out for quick, rapid swipes in all directions. On top of this, he requires the most amount of properly timed Zandatsu yet, with the players needing to cut up groups of projectiles he hurls at them as well as slashing his own forehead when he becomes invulnerable to standard attacks. Similar to how Monsoon punished the player for a lack of proper parrying, Sundowner acts as a hard counter to a lack of precise blade mode cuts. His shield doesn't just make him nigh invincible to head-on attacks, it actively harms the player to even try to attack him, though the shield can't be destroyed with aimed and careful use of blade mode. You know, or you can just jump over his head and swipe at his butt a bunch of times. You know, whatever floats your boat. And, after a more bombastic version of the Ray fight with Metal Gear Excellus, the final boss Armstrong acts as a near-flawless conclusion to the game, providing a clear final test on every major combat skill the player had learned up to that point. Armstrong's attacks can range from slow wind-ups to fast and frantic charges and stingers, so the proper timing for a parry is needed to consistently block them. There are also two major points where precise Sendatsu cuts are required. One attack sees him throwing boulders at the player, which acts as a merger between Monsoon's projectile attacks and Sundowner's shields, and another where you have to hit a specific glowing point on his back. Hell, it even brings in motifs from outside the boss fights, like the color coding for regular enemy attacks. Attacks which could be parried are highlighted in orange, command grabs that can't be are highlighted yellow. Now, people who have played Revengeance probably have noticed one major boss missing from this countdown, but don't worry, we'll get back to him. I promise. The point is, each of the bosses in the game tie back to testing the player on two fundamental levels of its combat system, with a clear escalation on what the developers expect them to pull off. With the defensive maneuvers starting from the automatic ninja run to single parries to chain parries, and the slow use of forced blade mode to optional use of precise cuts into outright requiring them to succeed. Outside of the substance of Revengeance, the style of the bosses also takes cue from that sense of escalation, as after the game's tutorial chapter, which we will get back to in a moment, each fight just gets bigger and grander than the last. You start off by fighting Blade Wolf in a ruined city street, the arena itself just being 2 lanes of a road. This escalates into fighting Mistral on top of and all around a burning, crumbling factory, which escalates into Monsoon, who fights you in the plaza in front of a massive skyscraper, using wrecked helicopters and an obelisk to try and kill you. And this escalates further still with Sundowner fighting you on top of said skyscraper, using working helicopters as both additional enemies and eventually a free ride for himself, which ends with a Space Harrier-esque flying finisher. And that's all without touching on the game's famous 2-phased final boss, which for those of you who still have not played the game, I will not dare spoil here. It has to be seen firsthand in all of its absurd glory, and trust me when I say, it could be made into a video all of its own. Now, I did say after the game's tutorial chapter, there was a constant sense of escalation, because the game starts off with one hell of a bang, featuring 2 bosses which served as a tone setter for the whole thing. Metal Gear Ray is a giant loud foe and an overt callback to older Metal Gear, Raiden's leading venture at MGS2, and despite the imposing figure it makes, it's actually a very simple and easy fight. The fight is mostly cinematic, with quicktime events and pre-rendered animations that serve to give the player this massive power trip. It almost acts as a vertical slice of the game as a whole. Basically, it's Platinum signaling to the audience, this is the kind of ridiculous experience you're in for, strap yourselves in. And this experience is almost immediately followed up on by the first fight the player has with Jetstream Sam. You know, rival characters are probably the most common trope in these kind of games, but god damn it if Sam isn't one of the better ones, and I'd wager the vast majority of his appeal stems just from the presentation. When first entering combat with Sam, he seems fairly unimposing. I mean, sure he carved up that tank at the beginning of the game, but just a minute beforehand Raiden, and by extension the player, just chopped up the final boss of a past Metal Gear for an introduction. Hell, Sam doesn't even have a boss health bar at the bottom right like Ray did. What threat did he really pose? Well, a pretty big one, since after the Ray fight instills this false sense of confidence in the player, Sam completely wipes the floor with them. By no means was the fight you can't win trope new or novel when the game came out, but here it's done extremely well. In direct contrast to Ray, which emphasized control over the situation, Sam here robs that from you completely, and Revengeance really draws this out too. After cutting off Raiden's arm, the game lets you ineffectually swing at him and attempt to walk away, though it is clear just how useless these efforts are. This fight hammers home 3 points. The new threats of Metal Gear Rising are the real deal, not the old ones from Metal Gear Solid. Secondly, bigger foes aren't always going to be the more dangerous ones. And lastly, it sets up Sam as a genuine threat and a clear objective. No matter what Raiden's goal is from a narrative standpoint, the player is always going to want to kick this guy's ass. Think of Sam 1 as a new starting point for Raiden as a character, shedding the MGS4 design and HUD elements and only progressing upward from there on out. The threats escalate in the spectacle and the challenge increases in turn, but all throughout the game, Sam has a subdued but ever-looming presence over things. With most of the bosses, barring Sundowner, who you meet a little bit at the beginning, Raiden only interacts with them shortly before the fight with them begins. But Sam, on the other hand, has a presence that the others don't. The Kodak team talks him up as a major threat, Wolf talks about working with him on past missions, he's the direct instigator for a major plot reveal, and the inevitable rematch with him is teased a handful of different times. And after Sundowner's dead, killing off every other member of the villain team in the game, Sam is left as the last one standing before the true final boss. But his fight stands out in presentation from the rest. Rather than having an arena more over the top than Sundowner, you fight Sam on the side of a highway in the middle of nowhere. There are also no other major gimmicks to the fight, it's a straight up sword on sword duel, which may sound out of place, but is exactly why I wanted to highlight just how much of a presence Platinum gives Sam here. The fight is just as climactic as the others simply due to the hours of build up it received, with all bullshit and pretense cut away. Hell, the game even pokes fun at this before starting.
I'm not talking about money, Jack. I'm talking ideals.
Excuse me?
Forget it. We've both heard enough speeches about higher causes by now.
Little things like that are what made the Jetstream Sam fight as stylish as it is, and those kind of small touches influence other aspects of the presentation. Revengeance's soundtrack is well known, with an OST filled with cheesy rock ballads for the bosses, but what's surprising is how well these work in context. Throughout the fights, the music will start to ramp up. Most tracks will only begin with instrumentals, but as the fight goes on with the boss with certain thresholds being met or them inching closer to defeat, the over-the-top power vocals kick in. I think anyone who has even heard of Revengeance has heard this bit right here. Pretty much every encounter with the bosses ends this way, and it's one hell of an impactful choice. And the final little capstone to most of these fights is just so damn satisfying. Cutting the boss up into a million tiny pieces while the soundtrack mixes out is the perfect conclusion to it all. If any boss in particular is giving you trouble, I mean the game's pretty easy, so don't know why it would, but if that's true, there's no better possible reward for victory. As I've been writing this script and hammering out these ideas, I've honestly grown to really respect Revengeance as a rock-solid action game on its own. I always liked the game from the moment I played it, don't get me wrong, but replaying it and mulling over has given me a bit more of an appreciation for how tight the final project turned out to be. And the biggest strength of the game from where I'm sitting is that while I can ramble on and on about the mechanics and presentation of the bosses, in the actual heat of the moment itself you won't notice any of these things. While playing, the music, unique attacks, and challenges that the bosses bring to the table, and the general spectacle of the whole scenario all mixed together to create a cast of truly memorable and impactful bosses. And without either the substance or the style of these encounters, Revengeance would be nowhere near the kick-ass romp that it turned out to be.